The following program is made possible by Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo, the next stage.
The political landscape has been shaken with one revelation after another of misconduct by male elected officials toward women. Is this a watershed moment for women in higher office? We ask one of the nation's leading advocates for the election of women to political office. The game is politics. The game is on. Welcome to the game. I'm Mark Simon, and we welcome back Mary Hughes, co-founder of the political consulting firm Hughes Company and founder of Close the Gap California, a campaign to achieve gender equity in the state legislature by 2028 through the election of progressive women. We've had Mary on before to talk about the effort, but now it seems to be an issue with a new sense of urgency about it. Mary, welcome.
Thank you. Nice to be with you.
Yeah, I guess where I want to start with, since the lead-in is this notion. You hear more and more women saying, women in prominent positions, that the only way what's going on with just day after day of somebody else, the only way it's going to get better is when women achieve true equity in the boardroom, in the legislative halls. And I would assume that's in your wheelhouse. I mean, that's really what you're about and why you're trying to do this.
It is. It is. We've been working on this for a long time. It's a moment, but it's a moment built on a lot of preparation and a lot of dissatisfaction. Yeah. So for this moment, with regard to the sexual harassment issue, think about it this way. The fierceness that you see was evident a year ago in the Women's March, before this really became everyday news and really pervasive in the news across sectors. So there was a dissatisfaction both with the results of the election last year, but also with the treatment of women that came out in the course of that campaign. But there was also a sense that when you are graduating women out of law school, medical school, architecture schools across this country in numbers greater, 50% or greater. And you look at those sectors in our country, and the decision makers at the top are almost always all men. In fact, in no sector, and I always hesitate to say that because there'll be one, but generally speaking, women in decision-making powers, women in office, state legislatures, statewide office holders, women in Congress, still 19% of the body, 23%, 24% of state legislators, big city mayors, right around the same number. So women, there has been this glass ceiling, which we sort of, that's a phrase we use. But the truth is, across sectors, in politics, women have not been able to move into the most powerful positions, and that has created a real question about why that is, and the frustration about the general disrespect for women and their concerns that has come up in that's embodied right now by the pervasiveness of sexual harassment. That has given women a place to focus. But this is much more widespread. The problem is pervasive in terms of gender equity. And so now we're going to have that conversation.
Well, the things you're talking about, the circumstances you describe, is that essentially an invitation for official misconduct? I mean, what you're seeing are things that have been going on, in many cases, for years. Some of the lines are blurred. Not all misconduct has been created equal in this particular context.
Right, but that's troubling.
Is it? We'll get to that in a second. But is it an environment that essentially invites misconduct? I mean, some of these things, because they've been going on for a long time, you can almost hear somebody say, "I don't understand. This has been something I've been doing for years."
You know, I would say no circumstance invites misconduct when people are respectful, thoughtful, and ethical. It's not a circumstance that's at fault here. What happens is in a cult of personality in any business, in Silicon Valley, if you're somebody who can dispense large amounts of money and to start up companies, then you're an important person. If you're a state senator, you're an important person. And most always, those people are men. And oftentimes now, the rising stars in those industries are women and younger women. And so is that a formula that should say, okay, understand your circumstances and proceed with caution? Perhaps. But do the circumstances create this? Absolutely not.
So when we had you on the show before, we talked about the campaign, which is to essentially reverse the trend. There has been a trend of declining numbers of women in the legislature, which I know you view with alarm. Is this an opportunity? There's always this tendency in my mind to think it's a mistake to think there's a singular moment where everything's going to change.
Agreed.
It's a process, it's attrition, it's time over time. Is this, but you see a story in today's newspaper, maybe it is a moment of hope for people. Is it a watershed moment?
Watershed moment, we'll have to wait and see. Is the opportunity great? Yes. Are more women, particularly voters, willing to say it would be a different environment if there was more gender equity among the members of the legislature? I believe women voters are aware of it. Women voters want to express themselves. And you have to go back in history and look at 25 years ago, following the Anita Hill hearings, where she was basically dismissed. She was just given her moment. Okay, we let her talk. Great, now confirm, let's go. So that was sort of swept aside. And the response was the largest single class of women ever elected to Congress in the next election. So there was obviously a segment of the population not happy about the way that hearing went, and you saw lots of bumper stickers, Anita, I believe you. And I think this is that moment in a slightly different context. Women are prepared. There are more women willing to run. There are more women's organizations ready to support them. And so far, we've seen that. We recruited, there was a special election in Los Angeles. I think 13 folks ran in the general election, 12 men, 1 woman who we recruited from Close the Gap. And she got into the runoff and she won. And her name is Wendy Carrillo, and Wendy will be the newest member of the Assembly sworn in. And we're proud of that, but I don't think it's accidental. She was ready to run. She knew what to do. There were organizations to support her. That is happening again with the openings that are being created.
So the reason you can take advantage, quote, if that's the right term, of this opportunity is because preparation has been done. There's been sort of ground level grassroots work, identifying people, getting them ready. I heard the other day that in this next cycle, there are 249 women who have been recruited to run for congressional seats.
It is the highest number of women, I think, ever who have filed for congressional seats. I believe that's correct.
So some of it is simply getting ready, as it were.
It is, but I would point out to you, and you're wise to be cautious, because in the same place I read a similar statistic. I think what I understood was that still a quarter to less than a third of all candidates, right. For Congress. So it's a slow road to parity.
Well, we're going to take a break. Mary's going to be back because she just said I was wise. You stick around. We'll be right back for the show.
It's been over 150 years since Wells Fargo first opened for business. Since then, we've enjoyed your community support, and we're passionate about returning it. Every day, Wells Fargo team members roll up their sleeves and donate their time to organizations and charitable groups throughout the Bay Area. Nationally, we've committed even more. In just the past 2 years alone, we've donated over $70 million to support schools and educational programs. It's a commitment we're proud of. Wells Fargo, the next stage.
Welcome back to the game. We're joined by Mary Hughes of the political consulting firm Hughes Company and Close the Gap California, which focuses on electing women, progressive women at the state legislature. 2028 is the year everything's going to change, apparently, because that's the year you guys mentioned in your materials.
Well, I think our calculation is that with a little bit of luck, it'll take us a decade to have the percentage of women in our legislature be north of 40%.
Which is the goal.
It
north
is the
of 40.
goal.
Not necessarily 50, but that would be defined as general equity, I guess.
No, most of the literature says if we can get between a third and 40%, we'll have an opportunity to change the agenda, the procedures, the culture of the institution. And I think right now it's pretty clear that's what we need.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you about that because, you know, just this year we've had this whole, the hashtag #MeToo.
Yeah.
We've had an astonishing array of women come forward, and virtually no woman I know has not had some experience where, at a minimum, they were made to feel uncomfortable and somehow thinking it was their fault that maybe they'd done something. Why didn't Donald Trump, during the campaign, have this sort of grief land at his feet, given that there are 16 women who say essentially what's been said about almost every other public figure now who's had to quit or has been dismissed?
Well, as with so much about this issue, it's complicated. It's complicated because I think there was an astonishment, first of all, that that denial is an answer. And I think that in the context of a presidential campaign where people are making new news every single day, it's hard to grab onto that thread and really follow it. So the combination of just astonishment at denial when the evidence is overwhelming, or in the case of the tape, you know, who are you going to believe, me or
your lying eyes?
Or your lying eyes.
Yeah.
And so it was just true astonishment that denial is a strategy, an okay strategy. So I think there was that, but I also think that people felt that don't get distracted. The important thing here is winning the election. You know, don't go down that road unless it's going to help win the election. So I think that in the political context of a presidential campaign, the notion of letting the voters sort it out was relied on. Mm-hmm. And I think that for many, many voters, there were bigger things to consider.
I also think the news media was struggling to sort it out. I remember there were accusations along these lines about Arnold Schwarzenegger that didn't really adhere to him. There were these accusations at a time when the news media is also being told, well, you're biased anyway. So I think there was a lot of, I think they got over that hurdle this year, but it's a year late maybe, I don't know. But should he have been, I mean, should he be now? I mean, there are people who say,
well, yes,
essentially they're saying he's a sexist and he should be held accountable for that.
Well, I think there are lawsuits pending. There are lawsuits pending. There is an effort in Congress. I think Congresswoman Lois Frankel from Florida said, we are investigating and calling to account all these other people. We haven't called to account our leader in the country. We have to do that. Yeah. So we'll see.
U.S. Senator Kamala Harris from California called on him to resign. Two is,
yes.
I don't think that's going to happen.
Seems unlikely.
Yeah. So what is, if you were going to define what this Me Too is now in a political context, what is it?
Solidarity.
Yeah.
It's a sense that we saw this dismissed a year ago. We will not have it dismissed again. Let's have it out. Let's put it all out there and let's discuss as a society why this is horribly wrong and what it has cost us. Because it's cost a lot in terms of women's confidence, their ability to be the CEO or on the board or in charge of the team or whatever it is. And that is wrong and it has to stop.
One of the things that you've talked about when you've talked before on the show about the Close the Gap campaign is that women change the way government works, the way governance is done.
Yes.
And it's an issue thing, largely, that there are sensitivities to issues to some degree that a male-dominated environment are not going to bring. Is it different now too? Is there something else, a new factor, or is it just a more evident factor that they change the interaction, the human level of it, not just the governance level?
Well, I think that's always been there. The reason women change an institution when they participate is that their experience, their perspective, what they bring to a conversation is different from what men bring to the conversation.
Different how?
Our experiences...
Because the implication there is not just different, better.
No, I don't think that's right. Okay. And I think that's why it's scary sometimes, why I think there's so much resistance in the institutions. It's not that we're different. It's not that one of us is better, but our experiences are different, and therefore what we bring, the priorities of our interests, which you alluded to. For years, women were sequestered in education, family issues, and that was horribly wrong, but there was this sense to it, which is that women would go there and they would see an issue from a perspective of often caring. Mm-hmm. So when we used to do taking care of veterans, we'd say, okay, what are your pensions? Can you go to school when you come home? And the more women who have gone on to committees, state and federal, that deal with veterans, the more veterans' families, health, long-term ability to adjust, mental health, all of those issues have been accounted for. And I shouldn't say I'm sure there's much more to be done, but my point is the perspective that women have about the whole person, the whole family, and what it means for public policy to really create whole, well communities is different than what men have brought. The literature is pretty clear about changes that women bring. What's on the agenda? How are we going to proceed? Women much more open, much more inclusive, much more wanting to get everybody's opinion into the situation. And this issue of perspective, when is public policy really addressing the whole problem?
Okay, we're going to have to take another break. Stick around, we'll be right back.
It's been over 150 years since Wells Fargo first opened for business. Since then, we've enjoyed your community support, and we're passionate about returning it. Every day, Wells Fargo team members roll up their sleeves and donate their time to organizations and charitable groups throughout the Bay Area. Nationally, we've committed even more. In just the past 2 years alone, we've donated over $70 million to support schools and educational programs. It's a commitment we're proud of. Wells Fargo, the next stage.
Welcome back to The Game. We're joined by Mary Hughes from Close the Gap, California, and her own political consulting firm, which happens to have the name of Hughes in it. I want to talk about two things because the show is rocketing by. One is there's a different response, apparently, between Democrats and Republicans to this. Al Franken resigns. Is there a difference? Is that something that still has to be ironed out? Or is that a political liability for one party or the other that they're not responding in the same way?
Well, I think there's a lot of jockeying for how to manage this issue to political advantage. I think that's what you're seeing in the United States Senate. The moral high ground, if you can get moral high ground and political advantage, you're really doing well.
Let's talk about something we alluded to earlier, which is people are being called on to resign before anybody's even checked out some of the claims that have been made by somebody else. There was a story about Bob Hertzberg in the Senate, state Senate, who loves to hug people, and now apparently he's made some people uncomfortable. He was so well known for that, he used to hand out pins that said, "I've been hugged by Bob Hertzberg." So the question, I guess, is how do we make the punishment fit the crime? Is that something, well, how do we do that? It's up to you. You have to decide.
In the intensity of these claims, I think judgment has sometimes been an afterthought. And I think that's unfortunate. I think everybody's entitled to due process. There are people who don't want to bother because their behavior has been so egregious, it's best to leave the stage. I think that's been true of most of the folks we've talked about. But I do think that where there are questions about whether someone's behavior is friendly or overly friendly, they deserve a hearing. And when we don't give people who deserve a hearing, then we really subvert the value of cleaning house. It diminishes the importance of real sexual harassment when we have not been able to take a nuanced and careful look at what behaviors exactly are we talking about. And we're not there yet.
Well,
I think we'll get there, but we're not there.
Well, I think one of the issues, though, is that you said what behavior exactly. I'm not sure this is exact. I mean, how do you draw exactitude out of what's going on?
Well, that's why sometimes you need a hearing. Sometimes it's just as simple as people misunderstanding. And as we've discussed, it's an area that sometimes lends itself to misunderstanding. But most of the cases, the vast majority, overwhelming majority of cases that have come to light have been about power and the exercise of the powerful over the adoring or the confused or the weaker or the less powerful. And that is unacceptable.
We were talking off the air before the show about this idea of a cult of celebrity, I think is what you called it. It's a different environment than 25, 30 years ago in terms of what our expectations are about what we know about these people.
Right.
How has that changed? How has that made it worse?
Well, I don't know. Again, I would be cautious to say that circumstances create the problem. But what we do know is that over the last 25 years, we've created a cult of personality where celebrity is everything. And that's a form of power. And that power in the hands of people who are not respectful, thoughtful, good judgment, or good values can go a lot of ways awry, and one of them is what we're seeing now in sexual harassment.
Yeah. You've been involved in politics for a long time. You've been on a first-name basis with quite a number of these elected officials. Have there been any that's particularly painful, that's like somebody you were really fond of, somebody you really thought highly of, and then you see that they're conducting themselves in this way, and it's an acute disappointment? Or did you not have such expectations?
Well, for one thing, I've worked with probably more women than most consultants, and so that has not been an issue. I have to say, though, that in the case of Senator Franken, I was both disappointed, but I thought his circumstances were the most unusual. And therefore, particularly since he asked for his day in court with the Senate committee, I was disappointed that he did not get that day in court. So that was unfortunate.
Yeah. You see somebody like Charlie Rose, who's had this phenomenal career, done wonderful, marvelous, insightful, and thoughtful interviews, and you see him brought down almost immediately by this. And I guess the question is it that tenuous? Can one mistake, or I guess it's not in his case one mistake, but can a mistake undermine an entire career?
I don't think we've seen any case in which a mistake has undermined a career. Yeah. I think what we've seen is a lot of aiding and abetting, whether it's for ratings points or profit or for fundraising prowess or whatever it is. There have been there's a lot of covering for people or looking the other way. And the good news about this, the time that we're in, is that there is no more looking the other way. You look the other way at your own peril for yourself and your institution.
Yeah, we're doing this show close on the heels of the election in Alabama, in which women voters did play a key role, although a surprisingly number of white women still voted for the Republican accused of not just harassment but illegal behavior. What do you think this foretells, if anything, for 2018 and the election of women?
It's better news than losing, but I am really cautious about what happened in Alabama. It is almost unbelievable to me that a person charged with credible charges, the kind of poor judgment, misbehavior, taking advantage, and as you point out, if true, these allegations are true, very serious, that he got 48.5% of the vote. So I don't take any comfort from that. There was, as there always is, there were many issues on the table for consideration. And if anything, I found it humbling because it said that issue is not so important to us. We have other issues, and there were other issues to respond to.
And we're going to have to stop on that note. Mary Hughes, thank you for being with us. And we'll see you again soon, I hope.
Thank you.
And thank you for being with us, and join us next time on The Game.